Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Vav, Daf 56 of Masechta Pesachim. So, what can I tell you about Daf 56? Well, the context for Daf 56 is all about these 6 things that the people did in Jericho. So that's really the context. And in the middle, we're going to have an awesome Gemara about that time that Yaakov Avinu wanted to share the Ketz Hayamin with his children. So, let us get started. We will begin at the Mishnah on Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Shisha Dvarim Asu Anshe Yericho. There were 6 things that the people of Jericho did. Al Shlosha Michu Biyadam, Al Shlosha Lo Michu Biyadam, and on 3 of them, the powers that be prevented them. They made a mecha. They made a what's a mecha? A mecha is a protest. 3 of them they protested against. The powers protested against. The rabbis protested against. And on 3 of them they did not protest. Okay. And the following are the 3 that went unprotested. Makivin the Kalim Kol Ayom, and we're gonna explain all of these things in the Gemara. So the first one that they did not protest is Makivin the Kalim Kol Hayom, that on the 14th day of Nisan, i.e. Erev Pesach, in Jericho they would graft trees, and that they didn't protest that. We're gonna explain what that means. V'korchin es Shema, and they would also do this thing called Korchin es Shema. We're gonna have to figure out what that means. V'kotzrin v'godchin lifnei Omer, and also before the Omer offering was offered on the 16th of Nisan, they would harvest and also pile up what they harvested, pile up their grains, and this was before the Omer was offered. Now we had learned earlier in the Masechta on Daf Yud Aleph that harvest, that if they would only bring the Korban HaOmer from particular areas. So if you didn't live in those particular areas, you were allowed to harvest the Korban HaOmer. So we're talking about, in Jericho is not a place where they would bring the Korban HaOmer from. So they were allowed to be harvesting and piling before the Omer was brought. And the following 3 were protested against. Here they are. Matirun Gamzios Shel Hekdish. They would permit Gamzios Shel Hekdish. What are Gamzios Shel Hekdish? That is that, so what they would do apparently is that when it comes to what kind of trees are we talking about? There were specific kinds of trees. Shikma trees, so sycamore trees, and carob trees. So sycamore trees and carob trees, what they would do is after they plant it, so after 7 years, they would then cut off all the branches. And then by cutting off all the branches, they would grow back more stark, a shtickle better. So there were these sycamore trees and carob trees that were planted, and then after 7 years, they cut off all the branches. And then they were makdish them. They designated them to the Beis HaMikdash. So they donated them to the Beis HaMikdash. They made them hektish. So then, but nonetheless, the people of Jericho continued to use the fruits that came from the branches that then grew afterwards. So the rabbis protested against that. Ve'ochlin mitachas anisharim b'Shabbos. We're going to explain what this is in the Gemara, but essentially, they would allow people to come into the field and eat from dates that fell down from the tree. Okay. And they would also take peah from vegetables, and the rabbis weren't into that. What does that mean? Peah, of course, is when you have a field. So you leave the corners of your field for poor people to take. Now, the thing is, that doesn't apply to vegetables. Now, one of the things with peah is that it becomes hefker, and because it's hefker, you don't need to separate truma and meiser and things like that. Now the thing is, if vegetables are pater are not relevant to the mitzvah of peah, so then then you have to take truma and meiser and all these kinds of things. Now the thing is that if they, while it may be very nice to leave peah from vegetables, if the laws of peah don't apply to vegetables, then they're tevel. And if you have these poor people coming and taking them, and they're assuming that because it's peah, they don't have to tithe them, they're going to be eating tevel. So because that could lead to an issue, so the rabbis protested. Now, Tana Rabbanan, the Gemara says that the rabbis taught Shisha Dvarim, also Chizkiah HaMelech, that there were 6 things that King Chizkiah did. Ashlosha Hodulo, Ashlosha Lo Hodulo. On 3 of them, that was cool, and on 3 of them, that was uncool. Ger Atzmos Aviv Al Mita Shachavalim V'Hodulo. He dragged the bones of his father, who was the evil, wicked King Achaz. He dragged them on a bed of reeds as like a way to disgrace him. And Rashi says in Dibra Masl, Ger Atzmos Aviv Mishum Kapara. So that it should be a certain kapara, atonement for him. But so he did that. So he dragged his father in he dragged the bones of his father in a bed of reeds, which was not a very honorable way to treat his father, but that was acceptable because he was wicked. Kites nachash anachoshes v'hodulo. He also ground up the copper snake that from the desert that the Yidden would look at, and then they would be healed. And also Gana Sefer Refuos v'hodulo. And thirdly, he hid away the book of what's a refuah? Like healing thingies. Refuahs. Solutions, healings, antidotes, remedies. Ich weiß nicht. Basically, there was some book where if you were sick, I guess you would look up in the book what to do, and then you would be unsick. But the thing is that then, as Rashi points out, and right, he says, libam nichna al chol yom elam misrapim miyad. The thing is that one of the nice things about getting sick is that then you remember the Eibishter, and you have a shtickle humility and maybe do a shtickle tshuva. But if you just have this book which just says, do X, Y, and Z, and then you're good to go, so then it doesn't have the humiliating, humbleizing effects of the sickness. So therefore he wow, I feel like I'm forgetting a few words. Humbleizing, yeah, that's probably not a word. And remedy, antidote, Sefer, book of healing thingies is probably also not the correct descriptor. Let's go weiter. So on those 3 things, they were like, yeah, King Chizkiah, way to go. Now, now on 3 things, that was not the case. They were like, yo, that's uncool. Okay? Kitetz dalsos shel heichal v'shigron lemelech Asher. He removed the doors of the heichal from the Beis Hamikdash and sent them to the king of Ashur as like a bribe. V'lohodulo, and that was like not okay. Sasa megichon elyon v'lohodulo. He also, when the Assyrians were coming, he blocked off the waters of the Gihon so that they should be unavailable to the Assyrian armies, and that was also not so good. Ibra Nisan, Ben Nisan, V'lohodulo. He also made a leap year in Nisan. Of course, a leap year is doubling the month of Adar. However, once it becomes Nisan, it's too late. You missed your chance. But he made a leap year in even once it became Nisan, which was too late, and they were not into that either. Now, I feel like this came up in Masechta Brachos or something, and we ended up saying that it was Davka, the last day of Adar or something like that. But anyways, that was considered uncool. Now, Markivin Dekalim Kolayom V'chule. So we said that in Jericho, one of the things that they did was that they did not protest against was that they would graft palm trees on the 14th day of Nisan, and that was considered, and they didn't protest. Okay, Heichi Abde, how exactly were they grafting these trees? So Amar Rav Yehuda, so it says Rav Yehuda, Maisi Asa Dara, so they would bring a moist myrtle branch, a moist hadas, v'shichra de dafna. Now, I thought shichra de dafna was some kind of chickpea beer or something like that. I don't know what chickpea beer would think, but then I looked it up in the art scroll and he said something else that I didn't know what that meant either, and I forgot to write it down, and so now I don't remember what the art scroll said. Can we just go with chickpea beer? I have a feeling if I tell you what that other thing was, it wouldn't make much of a difference. But you know what? Just to prove that, and to prove it to myself, I'm going to look it up quick. Be right back. Okay, it's juice from the berries of a laurel tree. Does that help? No. Let's go weiter. V'kimcha desare de lochalfe ale arbain yomin, and also the flour of barley that 40 days has not yet passed. Okay, so they would take these ingredients, and they would boil them, and then they would like pour it into the heart of the palm tree. Wow. In any tree that was within 4 amas of this tree that has this tincture poured into its heart, if you wouldn't do this same process to these other trees, they would immediately dry out. Alright, so this is what they were busy doing on Erev Pesach. Sounds fun. So Rav Acha ber Rava says that no, what his grafting thing is, they would take a male branch, like a branch from a male palm tree, and shtup it into the female palm tree in some like crevice in there, and that would be the grafting process. And that's what they were doing on Erev Pesach. Alright, whichever way it is, it sounds like it must have been a blast. Let's go weiter. V'korchen hashma, and they would do this thing called korchen hashma. What does that mean? So heichi avde, what exactly would they be doing? Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, Omer Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad v'lo mafsikin. Interesting. So says Rav Yehuda that what this korchen hashma thing is that they would say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and then Rashi explains that what this means is that they wouldn't extend the Echad. Do you remember we had a discussion about this back on, what was it, Daf Yud Gimel or something of Masechta Brachos? Rabbi Yisrael pointed out, he actually left us a voice note in the WhatsApp group about how anybody who was in the WhatsApp group from Mamish the beginning. Wow, how many Chevra were in the WhatsApp group Mamish from the beginning, from the early days. Anyways, if you were in the WhatsApp group, I remember listening to that voice note. I was in Singapore at the time, and I was walking back from the mall over there where I would get food, and that was where I heard that voice note. Anyways, he was explaining that you would extend the dalid somehow. Anyways, so what this korchen es shema is that so what were we talking about again? Right, so there would be korchen hashma, and the rabbis didn't protest. What this korchen hashma thing is that they wouldn't like extend the echad in order to create a separation between the echad and the v'ahavta. Okay? Rava Amar mafsikin ayu. Rava says that they would actually make a separation between Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and v'ahavta. El shayu omim hayom al levavecha. But they would say, the issue was that they would say Hayom ad levavecha demash, that today on your heart, demashma Hayom ad levavecha, which implies that today it should be on your heart, v'lo machar ad levavecha, but not necessarily that tomorrow these words have to be on your heart. Okay, that was the issue according to Rava. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ketzarayu korchen hashma. What is this korchen hashma thing? Which is very interesting, by the way, because you have two opinions over here. You have Rav Yehuda and you have Rava, which are both Amoraim, and now you have a Brisa. So why not just defer to the Brisa? But anyways, the Brisa says, Keitzad are you korchen hashma? What exactly was this korchen hashma thing? So Omer Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad v'lo hayu mafsikin divrei Meir. So Meir's opinion is like Rav Yehuda was saying, which is that they would say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and they wouldn't make a separation between Shema and Baruch Shem and V'ahavta. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says Rabbi Yehuda Mafsikin Hayu. They did taka separate between Shema and V'ahavta. El Shlohayu Omer Baruch Shem Kvad Malchuso L'Olam V'ed. But says Rabbi Yehuda, they wouldn't set. And they wouldn't, but they wouldn't say Baruch Shem Kvad Malchuso L'Olam V'ed in Jericho. So but the rabbis didn't protest against that necessarily. Okay. Now, how come we say Baruch Shem Kvad Malchuso L'Olam V'ed between Shema and V'ahavta? So the Gemara answers, K'didash Reb Shimon ben Lakish to Amr Rish Lakish, that it's like Rish Lakish says. You ready? Famous Gemara. Vayikra Yaakov Abana Vayomer He'asvu V'agidalachim, that Yaakov called his children in Parshas Vayechi before he passes away, and he said, gather and I will tell to you, right, what is going to be at the end of days. Because Yaakov legalus levanav ketzayamin v'nestaku mimenu shchina, that Yaakov Avinu, he wanted to reveal to his children the ketzayamin. As Rashi explains what ketzayamin is that that in Megillas Eicha that we read on Tisha B'Av, it says over there, Sheheshiv Achor Yimino Mipnei Oyev, that the Eibishter turned away his right hand when the enemy was attacking. He didn't, defend the Yidden. He turned away his right hand. So Yaakov Avinu wanted to reveal to his children what was going to be when God, no longer, right, puts an end to turning away his right arm, i.e. like what's going to be in the future. And then he lost the divine presence. He said, wow, he got nervous. He said, maybe, God forbid, there is some kind of psul, inadequacy, or problem in my progeny. Just like Avram had Yishmael, and Yitzchak, who had a child Esav. Maybe the reason why the divine presence has left me right now is because one of my children is a nudnik. Amru lo banav. So his children said to Yaakov Avinu, he said, no, none of us are nudniks. Shema Yisrael, listen, Yisrael, right? Yaakov is Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. God, Hashem is our God. Hashem is one. Just like in your heart, God is only one. Also in our hearts, it's all one. And at that point, Yaakov Avinu then said, Baruch Shem Kvad Malchuso L'Olam V'ed, that blessed is the name of his honorable kingship for all eternity. Amri Rabbanon Heichi Naivid. The rabbi said, okay, so now what do we do? Nomru, if we say Baruch Shem, Lo Amro Moshe, well, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say it in the Torah, so how could we just add something that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say? Lo Amro Moshe Rabbeinu. Lo Nomru, but if we don't say it, well, Amar Yaakov. But Yaakov Avinu did say it. So what do we do? Do we say it? Do we not say it? There's no right answer. Hiskinu Shiru Omrim also Bachshai. So they said, you know what? We'll whisper it. We'll say it under our breaths, which Lemaiseh, I imagine, is it's what I do. I assume I'm not the only one. Being that on Yom Kippur, that seems to be the only exception when we say it out loud. Amr Reb Yitzchak, Amr Dve Rabbi Ami, says Reb Yitzchak that they say by the Besmedrash of Rabbi Ami, Moshe Levas Melech, Sheiricha Tzike Kedera. It's like a parable to the daughter of a king who smelled some geshmaka spicy stew. That sounds very nice, right? Who wouldn't want geshmaka spicy stew? Im Tomar Yeshla Ginai. So if she says, I want some of that stew, well, that's not very mechubad for the daughter of the king to be like, I need stew. But Lo Tomar, but if she doesn't say anything, Yeshla Tsar. Well, that's annoying. Chaval, she wants stew. So what do? So kind of quietly, her servants brought her over some stew without making a whole to-do. Amr Biabo says Rabbi Abahu skinu sheyu omim also b'koram mipnei terumas aminin. Says Rabbi Abahu, where he was in Eretz Yisrael, they established that they should say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso L'Olam V'ed in a loud voice, because the minin, the nudniks were being nudniks, and they were saying that the Yidden are like silently adding stuff to the Torah. So in order to be transparent, they would just say Baruch Shem out loud and show that they're not hiding anything. Now in Narda, in Bavel, where they didn't have these nudniks like they had in Eretz Yisrael, so they would say it. They continued to say it quietly. Mistama, that's what I imagine everybody at Babylon Talmud does, but I'd be interested to hear if you don't. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a Braise, Shishadavarim also Anshe Yericho, there were 6 things that the people in Jericho did. Shlosha B'ritzon Chachamim, Ushlosha Shelo B'ritzon Chachamim. 3 of them was in line with the will of the rabbis. 3 of them were against the will of the rabbis. Velu and B'ritzon Chachamim, these are the ones that had the blessing of the rabbis, that were consistent with the will of the Chachamim. Here they are, Makivin de Kalim Kolayum. Okay, so as we saw, they would graft palm trees on the 14th of Nisan. V'korchen es Shema. They would do this korchen es Shema thing. Where they would there was machlokas, right? Maybe they would say Baruch Shem, maybe they wouldn't say Baruch Shem, but however we define korchen es Shema. V'kotzen lefnei Omer. And they would harvest before the Omer offering was offered on the 16th day of Nisan. Ve'elu shelo b'ritzon chacham, and the following things were against the desire of the rabbis. Gochin lefnei Omer, they would pile up their harvest before the Omer was offered. Ufortzin pirtzos beganosein, ufardosein, and they would make openings in the fences to their ganot, gardens, and their orchards. Lahachil noshir la'aniyim b'shnei batzoros b'shabbosos v'yom tovim, so that on years where there was not so much food, so then on Shabbos and Yom Tov people would be able to come into their gardens and take from dates that fell down from the date trees, and that was not a good thing. We will see why. Umatirin gomzios shel hekdish shel charv v'shel shikma tiv Reb Meir, and they would also permit, as we learned earlier, like they would after 7 years they would remove all of the branches from the tree, from like the carob and sycamore trees, and then they were makdish the trees, and then the people in Jericho were nonetheless eating the fruits that grew afterwards from the trees, and the rabbis were not cool with that. Amrullah, that is Reb Meir's opinion. Now the interesting thing to note about Reb Meir's opinion is that he's saying that 3 of these things the rabbis were like A-okay with, and 3 of them they were not. Now that is different than what we had said before, which is the rabbis protested it versus didn't protest against it, right? So Amrullah Reb Yehuda, so Reb Yehuda says to Reb Meir, "Im bertzon chachamim ayu osin, you kol adam osin kain." Well, Reb Yehuda says to Reb Meir, like, I don't understand one thing. If, let's say, the first 3 things, right, like, I don't know, being korech kriyas shema, so if that was birtzon chachamim, as you want to argue, Reb Meir, that like the rabbis were like totally okay with it, well then why doesn't everybody why isn't everybody korech kriyas shema, or why isn't everybody what was like the other thing, do this grafting kind of thing? No, so rather elu shelo b'ritzon chacham. So rather, says Reb Meir, no, none of these 6 items the rabbis were like excited about. The question is, did the rabbis protest against it or not? Was it so bad? Were they so against it that they actually had to take a stand? Right, so elu ve'elu shelo b'ritzon chacham mayu osin al shlosha michu biyadim v'al shlosha lo michu biyadim. The question is, did the rabbis take a stance against what they were doing? The answer is that for 3 of them, yes, the rabbis said this is not acceptable. For 3 of them, they were willing to let it slide. The following are the ones that the rabbis, let slide. Markivin dekalim kol hayom, that they would graft these trees on the 14th day of Nisan. V'korchen es Shema, and they would do this korchen es Shema thing, whether it means like that they wouldn't say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchus Olam Voed, or maybe they did, but or maybe like they made some kind of separation between Shema and V'ahavta, but then they said Hayom al Vavecha, whatever it might be. V'kotzin v'gochin l'fnei Omer, and they would also harvest and pile things up, pile up their grain before the Omer. So while the rabbis were not excited about any of these things, they didn't take a stand against it. And the following three things the rabbis mamish took a stance against. Here they are: Matir Gamzios, Shel Hektish, Shel Charav, V'Shel Shikma. That the people in Jericho permitted these branches of the sycamore and carob trees that were made hektish, ufortzim pratos begad nosein ufadosein, and that they would make breaches in their gardens and in their orchards, la'achil nesher la'aniyim, in order to feed the dates that fell off of the tree, b'shabbasos, to poor people, b'shabbasos v'yom tovim, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, b'shnei batzoros, in famine years. And we're going to have to see what the problem with that is. Like, why is that a bad thing? Sounds like a very nice thing. And finally, v'nos nempei liyerek, that they would separate the corners of their fields even for vegetables so that the poor people can eat. The problem with that is that since Peah doesn't apply to these vegetables, they're actually tevel, but if the poor people assume that they're Peah, they're not going to separate Shumei Meiser, and they're going to be eating tevel, which is a problem. So for these final three things, the rabbis actually took a stance against. So for none of them, the rabbis were like excited about them, for none of the six, but for three of them, they actually took a stance against. Three of them, they let slide. Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that when they harvested on before the Omer, that was against the will of the rabbis? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, all of the six items were against the will of the rabbis. Just for three of them, they let slide, but none of them the rabbis were happy about. So does Rabbi Yehuda really think that when it comes to Ketzira, harvesting before the Omer, the rabbis were against it? But we learn in the Mishnah, that the people of Jericho would harvest before the Omer, and the rabbis were like totally okay with that. That was completely acceptable. But they would also pile things up before the Omer, pile up the grain before the Omer, and that the rabbis were not happy about that. Okay. But nonetheless, the rabbis didn't protest against it. They weren't happy about the fact that they were piling up the grain, but they didn't protest. Now, who's the one that's talking about whether the rabbis protested or not protested? Rabbi Yehuda. That's right. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's about, saying whether or not the rabbis protested. And yet, this Brisa is saying that the rabbis were totally okay with harvesting before the Omer. So on the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that none of these six things the rabbis were happy about. Just on only three of them they took a stance against them. Yet we have this Brisa which is saying that the rabbis were completely okay with harvesting before the Omer, and that seems to be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So what's the deal? So the Gemara answers, well, the truth is that there's clearly a mistake over here in this Brisa with Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda says that there were six things that the people in Jericho did. Three of them the rabbis took a stance against, three of them they didn't. None of them the rabbis were happy about, and yet you really list seven things, because among the three things that the rabbi let slide, there was harvesting before the Omer, piling up before the Omer, the Korchen Shema, and also the what was the last one? The grafting of the tree. So there's four things over there. So rather, one of them needs to go. Get rid of this Ketzira thing, because the rabbis were completely okay with harvesting before the Omer. All right, sounds good to me. Right. So we said that in Jericho, they would, for whatever reason, they would permit these branches that grew on the sycamore trees and the carob trees, even though, like, other people were makdish these trees when all the branches were removed after 7 years. All right. Amru, they said, Avosenu lo ikdishu ele koros, v'anu natir gamzil shel hektish, shechar v'shel shikma. So they said, the people in Jericho, their logic was, well, our fathers, lo ikdishu ele koros, our fathers, they only were makdish like the trunk of the tree, like the actual body of the tree. V'anu natir gamzil shel hektish. But we're going to allow the branches that are going to grow after that. Shalchar v'shal shikma, of the carob and sycamore trees. And we're specifically talking about the branches that are going to grow after that, right? So meaning, they had these sycamore and carob trees. Then after 7 years, they removed all the branches. They were then, the earlier generations were then makdish these trees. And then the later generations said, well, our fathers were only makdish like the stump of the tree. We are making use of the branches that grew afterwards. And the people of Jericho figured, like the Manda Amr that says, that there is no issue of me'ila when it comes to things that grow afterwards. Whereas the rabbis held, well, granted that there might be an issue of me'ila specifically, but it's nonetheless not allowed. So that's why they were not so into the people of Jericho, eating and getting benefit from these fruits that grew on these trees that their fathers were like makdish. All right. Forts and pratzos v'chule, right? It says that they would kind of make breaches in the fence so that on Shabbos and Yom Tif, in like famine years, poor people would be able to come in and chop the dates that like fell from the tree. So that sounds like a very beautiful thing. What could possibly be the issue? Amr Ula, says Ula, Amr Shimon ben Lakish, machlokas b'shel machbedos. The machlokas is when it comes to the machbedos. Alright, what in the world are we talking about? So basically, we're talking about dates falling from trees. So I guess like the way that like a date palm works is that you have like the higher branches and then you have like lower kind of branches. So now in the higher branches, there's like these like other branches that like the dates, when they fall off the tree, they can like get stuck in these other branches. Now, if you want to chop the dates from those higher up branches, you're going to have to like climb up there in order to chop them. So if you have like dates that fell from the higher up branches and then like kind of fell into these other branches that are still high up, in order to chop them, you're going to have to climb the tree, and in order to get those dates, they already fell off the tree, but in order to get them, you're going to have to climb the tree. Now, there's lower parts of the tree where you can just chop them without climbing on the tree. So, says the Gemara, says Ula, the name of Reb Shimon ben Lakish, machlokas b'shel machbedos, that the machlokas is regarding the dates that are sitting there in the upper parts of the branches, that they already fell off the tree, but they're like sitting and resting on like the upper branches. That the rabbis are concerned, well, if you climb the tree in order to get these dates, well, then you might end up actually taking dates that are still connected to the tree, and then you're going to be like being an over and an issa to oraisa of separating something from a tree. And now you might be thinking like, well, isn't there an issue of like climbing a tree in general? I think it's a good question. Yeah, I think that there is an issue of climbing a tree in general, but the Gemara doesn't seem to be phased at this point. But we also end up kind of giving an alternative way of looking at this machlokas anyways. But in the meantime, we're saying that the machlokas is specifically regarding these dates that fell off of the branches, and they're just kind of like sitting there on these upper branches, and we're saying that if you climb the tree in order to take these dates, you might end up actually separating connected dates, and that would be like an Isser D'Oraisa. Where the people in Jericho figured, we're not concerned that maybe you're going to climb up the tree and then actually remove dates that are still connected to the tree. They weren't concerned, and therefore they said that you would be allowed you can have people come and take the dates that are in the upper parts of the tree. But if we're talking about the dates that are on the lower parts of the tree where you can just take them, well, everyone agrees that that would be okay. Amar le Rava. So now Rava says to Ula, but how can you take these dates from the lower parts of the tree? Aren't they mukta? Meaning, when Shabbos started, the dates were still connected to the tree. Then they fell down from the tree on Shabbos. When Shabbos came in, they were still connected to the tree. Shouldn't they be mukta? How come everyone agrees that you're allowed to just chop them from the lower parts of the tree? No, I'm sorry. And if you're going to say, but if you're going to say, well, they're not necessarily mukta, because if I have pet ravens, well then those ravens can eat the dates even when they're connected to the tree. And therefore, if they're not mukta for these orvin, then they shouldn't be mukta for me either. But now, hashta muchan la'adam la'avi muchan leklavim. Well, we learned at the end of Masechta Shabbos that the concept of muchan la'adam la'avi muchan leklavim, that if you have something that was set aside for human use, that doesn't mean that it's set aside for animal use. Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, im lo haisa nevela me'erev Shabbos asura, lefi she'ena min ha'muchan. So we said that if you have an animal that dies, so before Shabbos began, it was alive. Now when it dies on Shabbos, and now it's nevela, so you can't eat it, but the question is, can you give it to your dog? Well, we say, no, you can't, because it's muktzah. It's muktzah because, since before Shabbos started, you assumed that you were going to use it, that it was for you, and not for your dog. And therefore, since when Shabbos started, it was going to be for human consumption, for your consumption, and then on Shabbos, it died, so now it's nevela and you can't use it. You also can't give it to your dog because it wasn't set aside for your dog. When Shabbos started, you assumed that it was going to be for you eventually. So therefore, muchan la'adam lo avi muchan leklavim, right? Something that's set aside for human consumption or for human use doesn't mean that it's usable for animals. So if that's the case, that something that's set aside for human use isn't set aside for animals, well then muchan la'arvim, something that's set aside for ravens, for birds, having muchan la'adam, would be considered set aside for human use. And therefore, the point being that how in the world can we be saying that everybody agrees that you'd be allowed to use these dates that fell from the tree and are now in a lower accessible area of the tree, but when Shabbos started, they were still attached to the tree, so they're muktzah. And don't tell me, yeah, but ravens can eat them. The fact that ravens can eat them is irrelevant. So Amrle, Ula said, actually, you know what? The truth is, actually, since ravens can get them, that would be acceptable for human consumption. Because muchan la'adam lo avi muchan leklavim, because while something that's prepared, set aside for human use, will not be set aside for animal use, but the cholmide de chazil inish lo makatzele midaite. And that's because anything that could be used for human use, there's no chance in the world that you're saying, you know what, maybe I'm going to want to give it to my animal. No way, right? So meaning if you have this sheep or something that you were planning to eat, it doesn't even enter your mind that well, maybe I'll be nice and give it to my dog. No. And therefore, if that sheep dies, well, you were totally not assuming when Shabbos started that you were going to be feeding the sheep to your dog, so therefore you cannot. However, muchan le'arvim have a muchan le'adam, but something that's set aside for ravens, such as these dates that are still attached to the tree when Shabbos begins, have a muchan le'adam. They nonetheless would be considered set aside for humans as well, because because anything that could possibly be for human consumption, for human use, your intention is on it. And therefore, since it would be considered usable for the ravens and not muksa for the ravens, it's also considered not muksa for you. And when it falls from the tree, you'd be able to consume it. And therefore, says Ula, that the machlokas between the Chachamim and the Anshe Iricha is really concerning the dates in the upper part of the tree, because we're concerned that maybe you're going to climb the tree in order to retrieve those dates, and then you might end up like actually separating some dates from the tree and eating those, which would be a problem. Whereas the people in Jericho were not concerned. But if the dates were in the lower parts of the tree, everyone seems to say that you would be able to use it, and you'd be able to eat those dates. And we're not concerned about muktzah since they're set aside since they wouldn't be considered muktzah for the ravens. They're not considered muktzah for you. Now, Kiyasa Ravin Amr Shimon ben Lakish, when Ravin came, he said in the name of Rish Lakish, Machlokas B'Shel Ben Kifin, that no, actually the Machlokas is specifically regarding those dates that are in the lower part of the tree. Because the rabbi said no, just because these dates are set aside for the ravens to eat, it does not mean that humans, that would be considered set aside for humans to eat. Whereas the people of Jericho figured something that's set aside for the ravens to consume would be considered enough to be considered set aside for humans to use, and therefore you would be allowed to eat these grapes that fell lower down. No, not grapes, dates. But if we're talking about the dates that are on the higher branches of the tree, well, in that case, everyone agrees that you will not be able to eat those dates on the higher part of the tree because we're concerned that you might go up to chop them and then end up, plucking dates that are connected to the tree. And they would also give pay. They would set aside the corners of their field of vegetables. But why would the people of Jericho leave the corners of their fields full of vegetables for poor people? Do they not know of the Mishnah that says that there's a rule regarding payah? Anything that's food, v'nishmar, we're going to go through each one of these things in a second, and it's guarded, v'gidulo min haaretz, and it grows from the ground, v'likitaso ka'achas, and you gather everything in one go, u'machniso l'kiyom, and then you can put them away to store them, chayev b'peah. All of these things are things that the halacha of peah, of leaving the corner of your field for the poor people, peah would apply to these things. But kolshu ochel, so we see it has to be food. Prat l'sfiche sitim v'kotza, to the exclusion of sfiche sitim, the aftergrowths of, I think that would be turmeric. I think v'kotza was like some thing that they use for like blue dyes or something. One second, let me look this up as well. One sec. Okay, safflower and woad. What in the... Dude, first of all, what the heck is woad? W-O-A-D. Yo, Dennis, you gotta help us out over here. Now, safflower. What's that? There's like safflower oil, right? That's like a thing? Ich weiß nicht. Well, you don't need to... If you have your safflower or your gourd fields, you don't need to separate payah from it. Let's go weiter. V'nishmar, and also it has to be guarded prat lehefker, to the exclusion of if it is ownerless. Okay, v'gidulo min haaretz, and it has to grow from the ground. Prat lechmenu fitrios, to the exclusion, of course, of mushrooms and truffles that don't grow from the ground. They grow on trees and stuff. L'kitaso ka'achas, and you have to harvest all of it at once. Prat l'te'edim, to the exclusion of figs. Figs are always coming, they're not all ready at the same time. They're ready when they're ready, each one individually. Machniso l'kiyum, and you also store them away. Prat l'yarek, to the exclusion of vegetables that don't store very well. So what's the deal? How come they thought to separate, to leave payah from vegetables? Like, what about the Mishnah that says that clearly we don't? So Amar V'yuda Amarav, here we're talking about the heads of turnips. Umachniso, right? Umachniso l'kiyum ayde davar acher, that these heads of turnips, you can store them away if you store them away with the turnip itself. So them on their own, they don't preserve well, they don't store well. But if you kind of put the turnip with it, so then they can store decently. So that's what we're talking about. So. So in Jericho, they figured, well, since you can store these heads of turnips by storing them together with like the turnips themselves, so that's considered like enough to be relevant to Peah, so that's why they left Peah. So Umar Savar lo shmei kiyum, whereas the Chacham were like, no, that's not considered kiyum, and therefore it's not considered, since they on their own wouldn't store well, so therefore like they're pater from Peah. Alright. Tanu Rabbanan Yunosnim Peah lefes v'lekruv. So the rabbis taught that in Jericho they would leave Peah by turnips as well as cabbage. Rabbi Yossi Omer Afle Kaflot. Rabbi Yossi says not only that, but even leeks. V'tani idach. We have another verse that says Yunoslim Peah lefes v'lekaflot, that they would take Peah, that they would leave Peah from turnips and leeks. Reb Shimon Omer Afle Kruv. Reb Shimon says even cabbage. Nema tlasa Tanoi Avu. So let's say that there were 3 Tanoim. There's the Tanakama, there's Reb Yossi and Reb Shimon. Lo Trei Tanoi Avu. No, there's only 2 Tanoim. There's Reb Shimon and there's Reb Yossi. V'Tanakama de Reb Shimon and Reb Yossi. V'Tanakama de Reb Yossi and Reb Shimon. In the first brisa, when we have a Tanakama and we have Reb Yossi, so the Tanakama is Reb Shimon. And in the second brisa, when we have the Tanakama and Reb Shimon, the Tanakama is Reb Yossi. Okay? Umay af akamaisim. When we say af, it means the first one. So meaning, the way to understand it, okay. Reb Shimon's opinion is that, so they both agree that you're going to leave Peah from turnips. The question is, do you also leave Peah from leek and cabbage? So Reb Shimon's opinion is that you leave Peah for turnips and cabbage. Reb Yossi's opinion is that you leave Peah from turnips and leeks. And therefore, in the first brisa, when it says that in Jericho they would leave it for turnips and cabbage, Rabbi Yossi says also for leeks, it means for turnips and also leeks, but to the exclusion of cabbage. And Reb Shimon, when he says also for cabbage, it's in addition to turnips, but not to include leeks. Okay, great. Like basically, there's only 2 opinions here, Reb Shimon, Reb Yossi. Reb Shimon says turnips and cabbage. Reb Yossi says turnips and leeks. Chevra, that was Daf Nunvav of Masechta Pesachim. I hope you enjoyed it very, very much. Really, the context for this daf was around the 6 things that they did in Jericho. Along the way, we learned about Korchen Shema, which was very interesting, about the different opinions of, does it mean that they just would go straight from Shema into Ve'ahavta, or maybe they took a break, but they would say like Hayom Alav Avecha, which implied that maybe tomorrow it doesn't have to be on your heart. Then we saw there was the opinion that they Korchen Shema means that they didn't say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso L'Olam Voed. And the question is, where does that come from? We had a very interesting story of Yaakov Avinu, that when he wanted to reveal the sort of like end of days, or Kilu, when God will reveal his right arm, his strength, so then he got sort of the divine presence left him. So he was nervous that maybe one of his children is a nudnik, and they affirmed that none of them are nudniks, and they said Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, to which Yaakov Avinu responded Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso L'Olam Voed, and they didn't know if we should include it in the Shema or not, since it's not included in the Torah. So we kind of have a compromise position where we would whisper it. Rabbi Abahu says that in Eretz Yisrael, where they have their own kinds of nudniks, the minim, who I think are these early Christians, so they actually would say the Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso L'Olam Voed out loud, so that the minim wouldn't say that like we're trying to hide something. Okay, fine, very good. Then we got this interesting machlokas between Ula and Ravin, that Ula said that right. So we were talking about that in Jericho they would make breaches in their fences so that people can come in and take the dates that fell from the tree. So according to Ula, the machlokas is specifically on the higher branches of the tree, because the rabbis were concerned that people might climb the tree and then end up plucking things from the actual tree, and therefore they said don't do it. Whereas in Jericho they figured, no, we're not concerned you're going to pluck things from the tree, but the things that fell down, they're lower down on the tree, everyone agrees that you'd be able to consume those on Shabbos. And there's no issue of muktzah, because since it's muchan l'orvim, it's also muchan for humans. According to Ravin, however, no, everyone agrees you would not be able to climb up the tree, because we're concerned you might climb and pluck things off the tree. The machlokas was when they fall and they're lower down on the tree. In Jericho, they figured, look, since the ravens can eat it, also humans can eat it, and it's not muktzah. The Chacham said, no, just because the ravens can eat it, it would be muktzah legabe, the humans. Well, that was Masechta. No, that was Daf Nun Vav, Masechta Pesachim. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.